Hello everyone, Rebecca here from Stocking My Pantry, and in today's video we're going to be canning chili con carne. I'll be doing it in my Nesco canner, but you can use any canner you want as long as it's a pressure canner. You do need a pressure canner for this. I got this recipe from the USDA Guide to Home Canning, and the recipe states that it makes 9 pints. Now obviously you can fit a maximum of 5 pints in the Nesco canner. I happen to have 2 Nesco canners, so I have prepared 2, meaning I have 2 sets of hot jars and hot water all ready to go. If by chance you only have 1 Nesco canner, the way that you can work around this is you can either make a half a recipe or you can make a full recipe, and then after the first canner load finishes processing and cools down and all of that, you can load up more jars and run a second load. Now, one thing to be aware of is if you do that, if you do 2 loads, whether you do it on the same day or you do the second one on the next day, what you'll want to do is allow the chili that's in the pot that's left over to cool down and then put it in the refrigerator. And then the next day before you can it, go ahead and bring it up to a simmer again so that it will be hot. And that's actually what I did. I made this chili last night. This is a little bit of a long process. It's not difficult. It's actually a very easy recipe, but it took a while to prepare, and I knew I wasn't going to have time to do it all today. And so that's totally fine to do that. If you want, you can make the chili one day and can it the next day, or if you don't have a large enough canner or you don't have 2 Nescos, whatever it is, you can break the process into a couple of days. What I did is I actually filmed the making part last night. I'm not on camera, but I'm filming it, and then I did a voiceover. So I'm going to put in that part of the process now. Okay, so you're going to start off with 3 cups of dried pinto or red kidney beans, and you want to wash them thoroughly and pick out any rocks or, any split beans, anything that doesn't look quite right. Next, you're going to put them into a 2-quart saucepan, and you'll add cold water to a level of 2 to 3 inches above the beans, and you'll soak them for 12 to 18 hours. So after you soak them, drain and discard the water, and then you're going to combine the beans with 5.5 cups of fresh water and 2 teaspoons of salt. You'll bring it to a boil, you'll heat, and you'll simmer them for 30 minutes. Now, a lot of times people think that this isn't really necessary. You'll see people who start with just dried beans and they don't bother doing the soaking and all of that, and I get it, it's convenient, but it really is important to do the soaking and the simmering and all of that, because the canning recipe times are based on the beans already being hydrated and partially cooked. So while they do end up being cooked all the way through, even if you don't do the soaking and the partially cooking method, if you don't do that whole process, it may seem like everything's okay, but it really is not. So be sure to do that. Even if you've done it the other way with just dry beans, be sure to do that anyway. Okay, now you can see that by the time I finished simmering them for 30 minutes, the water's pretty well soaked up. It's not completely, but it's absorbed to a large degree. Then you're going to take 3 pounds of ground beef, and I actually only have 2.5 pounds of ground beef. And it's just the way that it worked out with the beef that I bought. I had 2.5 pounds. And it is okay to go with a little smaller amount of ground beef, but do not use more. And the reason for that is because there can be, the more beef that you have, the denser it is, and it may not heat through properly during the canning process. So less is okay, more ground beef is not okay. And so it says to put it in a large skillet, but when I looked at all the different ingredients that would be needed, I didn't think that there would be enough room, and so I put it into a larger pot. Okay, so I then put in a cup of chopped peppers of your choice. I used bell pepper, and that's optional, and 1.5 cups of chopped onions. And then you just simmer it together, simmer the ground beef and the onions and the peppers together until the ground beef is all the way brown. So about the peppers, I mentioned that I used bell peppers. You can use a combination of green peppers, bell peppers, jalapenos, whatever, just depending on your preference. And you just cook and stir. You don't have to stir constantly, but occasionally. We all know how to ground beef, right? How to brown ground beef. So anyway, that's what you're doing in this process. And it's kind of hard to see, but there is just a little bit of fat at the bottom. And even if there didn't appear to be, once you've finished browning the ground beef, you want to go ahead and drain it and rinse it, get rid of all that fat. And then you'll take it and you'll add it all back to the pan. Okay, at this point it's time to add your spices. You're going to put in 3 teaspoons of salt, 1 teaspoon of black pepper, and then it says to do 3 to 6 tablespoons of chili powder. So obviously you have some flexibility with the spices. So what I decided to do is I put in 3 tablespoons of chili powder, and then I added in some different spices that I like to use in my chili. I put in a tablespoon of ground cumin. You can see I'm not being super careful with the measuring there, and that's totally fine. I also did a tablespoon of smoked paprika because I like kind of that smoky flavor. And then I also used a tablespoon of granulated garlic. Now, none of those are required. Obviously, the recipe is 3 to 6 tablespoons of chili powder. When it comes to canning, you do need to follow recipes. However, spices is one area that you have some leeway in. Dried spices, you can add what you want. Okay, next I'm going to add in, the recipe calls for 2 quarts of crushed or whole tomatoes. Now, these cans of tomatoes were 28 ounces each. A quart is 32 ounces. So what I decided to do is I put in the crushed tomatoes, and I actually had some leftover tomato paste from another recipe that I had used. It was less than 4 ounces. And, rather than waste it, I thought I would put it in this. And tomato paste is obviously thicker than crushed tomatoes or other canned tomatoes. And so I also put in a couple of 4-ounce glasses of 4-ounce containers of water. And then I put in the beans that were partially cooked and that I had drained. Okay, now you can see how full the pot is. There's no way that this would fit in any skillet that I have anyway. And by the way, about the tomatoes, it probably would have been totally fine to just use the 28-ounce cans of tomatoes. And even though it called for 2 quarts of tomatoes, but I figured it didn't hurt to go ahead and add a little bit of extra tomato and a little bit of extra water in. And then obviously you just mix and stir it all together. So you need to bring it up to kind of a simmer and simmer it for about 5 minutes. Now this was thicker than I prefer. And also when you're canning, you're not really going to go wrong with things being thin, but you can go wrong with it being too thick. And so that's why I decided to add a little bit of water. And I believe when the camera wasn't going, I added about another ½ cup of water. So I probably put in at most about 1 cup of extra water. Again, that's not required, but it will, oh, there I go, just adding a little bit from the can. And so the heat will penetrate a little bit better with it being a little bit thinner. So again, going thinner is okay, going thicker is not okay. All right, and so then you can see it's beginning to simmer, and I simmered it for 5 minutes. Now, since I did this the day before, the night before, I basically let it cool and then put it in the fridge overnight, and then I reheated it in the morning before I filled my jars. So I didn't take it straight from the fridge with it being cold. It was hot when I put it into the jars. Okay, so now let's go ahead and fill our jars. Okay, so I have heated up my jars in my Nesco. If you don't know how to do that, I will leave a link for that. But I'm just going to open up the canner and get my jars out. I have 1 regular mouth and 4 wide mouth. That just makes it easier to get the jars out of the canner. If you have canned 5 wide mouth pints in your Nesco or Carey, you know how hard it is to get it out. So there's a couple of ways to work around that. One is put a canning ring under one of the jars so it lifts it up, and the other is to use 1 wide mouth or 1 regular mouth jar, and that's what I'm going to do today. According to the recipe, we're going to fill the jars to 1-inch headspace. And by the way, I'm kind of stirring around with the ladle as I go because there's some parts that are more liquidy and then some that are thicker, and I want to evenly distribute the liquid. I actually did add a little bit more water than the recipe called for, a little bit more liquid, and the reason was that the chili was a little bit thicker than I like, and also it can kind of thicken as it cans. Now the recipe, since it's a USDA recipe, it should be totally fine and liquid enough as it is written in the instructions, but the thinner that the chili is, the better it processes. Now, obviously, you don't want it like soup because you're making chili, right? But adding a little bit more water is not going to hurt anything. It'll just, I might get a little bit more than 9 pints out of this. Now this one, I can tell the first one I put a little too much in, but we're going to debubble all of the jars, and then we'll spoon some out or spoon some in, as whatever the case may be, to have each of the jars at the 1-inch head. Now this one I can already tell, as I said, that it's above 1 inch, and this one has less than 1 inch. So I'm going to start off by just putting some from this jar into this jar. And I'm making a little bit of a mess. I'm spilling some on the rims, but that's okay because we're going to wipe them real good. Okay, everything is now at 1-inch headspace, and I'm going to go ahead and wipe the rims. Then we'll get the lids on and get them into the canner. One thing I wanted to mention, in this book, there's several different recipes that have both quart or pint jars. This one only has pint jars. And so I believe it's because of the thickness of this and how dense it is that you can only use pint or smaller jars. So that's what I'm going to do, even though for our family a quart would be good with this. Although I have to say my husband loves chili and sometimes he's hungry. So I can see him grabbing a jar, and that would be perfect for him. A pint would be. But since it doesn't give instructions for quarts, please plan to use pints for this. Okay, now we're going to get the lids on. And the rings fingertip tight. So we're going to go ahead and put them into the canner now. And remember, you can maybe see, I don't know if you can, that the water is hot that's inside the canner. Okay, we'll put the lid on, turn it to the closed position. We have the valve in the exhaust position, so we're going to start there, and I'm going to come around and punch in the time and everything else into the canner. Pressing high, putting in a time of 75 minutes, and pressing start. Okay, now again, the valve is in the exhaust position. It will take a while for this to come up to heat, and then it will display E10 on the screen. It will count down from E10 to E0 and beep. At that time, I will put the valve to the airtight position. And I have a whole separate video on how to pressure can in the Nesco, so if you need more instructions and you need to actually see each step in the process, be sure to check that out. Okay, so off camera, I'm going to go ahead and fill the rest of the jars and get them going in the other canner. At the very end, I'm going to bring you back to show you how many jars of chili I got and what the end result is like. And by the way, I already gave a little sneak taste test, and the taste is delicious, so I'm really looking forward to this. I'll see you guys in a while. Okay, all of the jars are out of the canner. I ended up with 10 pints, and I actually had a little bit of extra, so I'd simmer it in just a little saucepan with some water until the beans cooked all the way. And so that's something that we'll eat sooner rather than later. It does look like all of them have sealed, but it's a little too soon to tell. It did work out well having 2 regular mouth jars, one in each canner, because that did make it easier to get them out. So I definitely recommend that. I'm going to lift one up so that you can hopefully see it. And I will also take a close-up picture of them, and so that you can see it that way. It is still bubbling a little bit. They don't look super watery, so I'm kind of glad that I did put the extra water in. Like I say, I was following a approved recipe, a safe recipe from the USDA, so even without the extra water, it should have been fine. But if you're ever in doubt and something seems real thick, it doesn't hurt to add a little extra water or broth to it so that it's a little bit thinner, and you can always thicken it up a bit after you, when you go to serve it, just by simmering it a bit. So anyway, I hope that you found this helpful. If you did, I would really appreciate it if you would like the video, and if you haven't already done so, if you would subscribe to my YouTube channel. Thank you so much, everyone. Have a great day.